Well, thank you to all of you, and thank you to Phil, or as I like to call him, Mr. T, you know. I think I don't need that. And yeah, it's a pleasure to have this show. I have to be honest with you and tell you that I routinely decline invitations to speak to people after dinner, because my feeling is that you always have a kind of divided set of motives after dinner. There's part of you that, yes, is really interested in the noble cause of who we want our graduates to be and what should what is the tea kind of all about. And then there's another part of us that really just wants to be burped and tucked into bed, you know? So for those reasons, I, of course, am not going to go on too terribly long, but it is also good to be here, because even though I have been on the faculty at Harvard for 40 years, a fact I feel like I need to apologize for, I'm actually a Big Ten guy at heart, because I grew up in Minnesota. The first sporting events I can remember going to, sitting next to my father, were watching the Golden Gophers, play the Spartans and the other Michigan for the little brown jug and all of that stuff. So in some ways I feel like I'm actually home. Now, so Phil would probably lead you to believe that I'm some sort of an expert on the tea. If you're an expert on the tea in Boston, it means you know something about the subway system or something like that. But I'm not going to come before you as an expert on the tea. I will come before you as a kind of amateur, but one with a lot of interest in the subject, having spent 40 years in higher education, being a professor at a school of education, and having as a professional field the whole subject of adult development and adult learning. It does kind of put its arms around the topic of the tea, and happy to share some thoughts with you on that subject. I was also, as I was appreciating your introduction, Phil, thinking about an introduction I received just a couple of weeks ago from a friend who either had a Freudian slip or he just decided to speak his real truth, and he said, "I've heard Bob Kegan speak on many occasions, and I don't know how he does it, but each talk he gives is better than the next." So I'll let any of you who've had the pleasure of being in my company before decide whether I'm going to fulfill that. So since I am a professor in a school of education, I thought I would start with a little math problem just to get all of your attention. And it goes something like this. If 13 frogs sat on a log and four of them decided to jump into the water, how many frogs would be left on the log? Now, I know that some part of you wants to say 9, but I want to suggest that a better answer might be 13, because there is a big difference between deciding and actually doing it. And that might be actually the theme of my remarks. So I have organized my thoughts, such as they are, about the tea into 3 categories. The first category is called to a tea. The second is called teed off. And the third category is called teed up. Maybe you can see the theme there. So I'm going to start with this category that I call to a tea, which has to do with really my admiration for why you're here and for what you're about to take up in the coming days here at this conference, and why it is that I do actually believe that the T-shape fits to a T the kinds of needs that the society will have of graduates increasingly in the 21st century. Now, anybody who's ever led a program in a university, a program or a department or a whole school or even a whole university, has had to kind of give thought to this big question of what are we trying to produce? What do we want, a graduate kind of ideally to look like? And the T is not the first time that the fast answer to that question has been to kind of advert to the notion of a shape, right? We used to talk about the well-rounded graduate, which, is a different kind of shape, but is hearkening a bit to kind of the same thought that you want somebody who's not just a specialist in a given field. And the notion kind of well-roundedness led to something which at the time was a bit of a revolution, the notion of a core curriculum, right? And the idea that there would be certain common courses across the sciences and the humanities and the social sciences that we'd want all our students to take so that there would be a kind of common foundation. But I think that the T is particularly well suited to 21st century kinds of needs and aspirations, and kind of recognizes both the triumphs and the limits of the 20th century, which, if that doesn't strike you as too grand a topic, after dinner, I want to briefly kind of give you my sense of. The great triumph of the 20th century was an enormous buildup of knowledge and capacity to handle information in every field and sector. Just for example, imagine a doctor in practice today, in contrast to 100 years ago, is the beneficiary of an extraordinary buildup in diagnostic and treatment capabilities. But all the genome projects and sophisticated surgeries and wonder drugs in the world are actually puny in the face of a problem which in medicine gets called patient non-compliance. That it doesn't matter how much you learn in kind of the knowledge buildup, if you have nothing to bring to this very hard problem, that people won't stop the behaviors that make them sick or do more of those behaviors, like regularly take a prescribed medication that will make them well, then to just keep drilling in the same direction and keep increasing our capacities, our pharmaceuticals and our surgeries without finding some way to deal with this problem against which medicine even today is not very powerful, seems like a losing proposition. Or just to take another field, my colleague at Harvard, Catherine Snow, who's a world-renowned expert in literacy, says that we already know and developed, through the 20th century, about 95% of what we will ever need to know to teach kids how to read. And yet most of our schools don't deserve anything like a grade of 95 when we take a look at the reading scores, for our kids. So we have a lot of knowledge, but we haven't, figured out a way to deploy it so well that we get the biggest benefit of it. Or if you look in the world of business, the accelerated capacity that management specialists have to study businesses and their practices, has been extraordinary through the 20th century. The new technologies make it possible to array and sort and quickly reassemble enormous amounts of data. Social science research and theory developed over the last century dramatically increased the capacity of analysts to assess the dynamics of organizations and their subunits and individuals, and world-class management consulting firms are able to provide advice and strategies that are often extremely good on paper, that are received by company leaders at great cost with lots of appreciative enthusiasm and a genuine commitment to actually pursue these paths. That is, they decide to jump into the pond, but when you come back, a year later, they're still on the log. And all this expensive planning and strategy is sometimes, sitting somewhere in a file or on a shelf. Nothing anything like what the consultants and the leaders had hoped for actually happened. So our inheritance from the last century is an extraordinary buildup of the knowledge base in, for example, medicine, business, and education. And yet here we are entering the new century with legitimate concerns about our capacity to keep ourselves healthy, about our capacity to educate our young, or our ability to recreate our businesses in ways that we will need to fulfill the demands and the aspirations of the 21st century. So if this new century is not going to just coast on the knowledge momentum, of the 20th century, then we are going to need to, in some way, kind of change the game and not just do more of the same. Doing more of the same, only harder and faster, is just going to get us more of the same. So, having celebrated the 20th century, what do these limits amount to? It seems to me they amount to three big gaps, and I see that the aspiration for more kinds of educating may actually serve well to address all three of these gaps. So the first gap, you can see it up there beautifully in the screen and in the living color and so on, is the technology talking gap. No, I'm just kidding. It is the knowledge doing gap. The gap between, deciding and what we're actually going to be able to do. That it turns out that applying what you know, transfer of knowledge, isn't anywhere near as simple or straightforward an activity as we might think. The second big gap is the problem of non-communicating disciplinary silos. That just about every academic in this room has had the experience of finding that you had the best conversation with a colleague from your school, maybe even from your department, at a conference 3,000 miles from home. Why? Because a space was sort of created there that made it possible for you to have conversations that bridged your particular separate expertises. My dinner companion reminded me that one of the definitions of a university is a loose confederation of independent contractors who are joined by a common interest in parking spaces. So that is a genuine problem. I mean, in all due modesty, if we really just step back enough and look at this extraordinary institution of the higher education institution, especially the research-oriented higher education institution, I mean, it is potentially should be an enormous treasure in our society. It's an incredibly privileged space to spend one's professional life. Extraordinary investments of private and public dollars go into enabling people to not only educate the next generation, but also think about what is most needed in terms of building up kind of what we need to know. It's a perfectly legitimate question for society to ask whether spending that much money, putting all these extraordinarily bright people together in one place, giving them the kind of luxury and space to kind of work on the problems they do, our universities, are they really delivering as much as we might hope that they would, especially in a day when any difficult problem cannot be solved by one discipline alone. And so you then have to look to the university and say, how good a job, does it do, teaching us how to collaborate, how to work, across the particular disciplines, the thing that the horizontal aspect of the T is all about. So that's the second big gap. The first is the knowing-doing gap. The second is this gap with the silos, the insufficiently communicating across our different disciplines. Take any hard problem. So just to give you a parochial one, we've now discovered, that we really need to think about how to teach kids to read, not just in their elementary years, but in the adolescent years as well. How do you really teach literacy powerfully in middle schools and high schools? Okay, who do we need to really move the needle on a question like that? We will need, of course, literacy specialists, but we will also need people who know something about adolescent development. We will also need people who know something about the way organizations resist changing. And until we can actually talk to each other across our different knowledge domains, it's unlikely, that we're going to be able to succeed by each of them kind of working in their own particular silo. And the third big gap is what I would call the self-mastery gap, the ways in which the university has historically been too exclusively oriented to, if you'll pardon the kind of brain particular references, too oriented to the neocortex, too oriented to the rational, analytic side of the human being, kind of not recognizing that there's a whole other part, of our wiring that has to do with the ways, in particular, that we handle anxiety and uncertainty and the prospect of loss. And if we're going to keep believing, well, this is more the province of the clinics, this is something we hope the counselors will take care of, and mental health specialists, then we're acting as if the educated person is purely her neocortex or his neocortex, when in fact there are all these processes that create blind sides and that interrupt our capabilities to make maximum use of our good analytic side. And if the university is going to continue to say, okay, that isn't our domain, then really, I think, 100 years from now, you always kind of think, how, what are people going to slap their foreheads about and say, can you believe they didn't think women should vote? Can you believe they didn't have any child labor practices? What are they going to say, 50, 75 years from now about 2015? Can you believe that they thought that the only thing that was important about educating was just kind of the rational analytic functions of the mind, when those functions are so continuously, multiple occasions per day, interrupted by the ways that we get triggered by all kinds of amygdala hijacks that kind of make us feel that we're in the presence of some kind of potential loss, to pretend that that is not a part of who the person is, to pretend that that isn't a hugely important dimension of success on the job. Emotional, psychological self-management is a very, very contracted notion of who is the person we have the opportunity to study and support. You can see I feel a little strongly about this one. So here we have these three different gaps, and if you saw the beautiful slides, you would see that those three gaps then turned into a kind of lock, and that we have to figure out a way to unlock this problem, and then you would see the T shape moving right into the lock and opening it up. I hope I brought that to life for you. My assistant is going to be so discouraged when I go home and tell her, all those slides you made, we didn't use them. Okay, the second part of so all of that is to say that I think the aspiration of the T fits to a T what is most needed in thinking about kind of 21st century learning. The second part of my remarks is teed off. So this is the possibility that I'm going to annoy a lot of people in the room, especially those of you who identify yourself as university people. Because really, if you looked around in society and said, who do you think would be best able to really teach to the T shape? Who do you think would be best able to prepare somebody with not only this kind of depth and this kind of breadth? Would the first place you would really think to look be a research-oriented kind of, top-tier kind of university where all the incentives are built to essentially support your distinction in the vertical depth, not in the breadth? How do you become, a tenured faculty member, in a research university? Oh, by just really developing your collaborative abilities with faculty and other disciplines, and doing a lot of co-publishing, so that nobody can figure out when it comes time to kind of tenure review who should be getting credit for what? No. Here's a little formula you would also see in a slide. If you want more T-shaped graduates, you need more T-shaped universities and more T-shaped faculty. So this is the theme of humility that I think it's, I have the opportunity and the privilege to kind of inject into the eve of the conference. That, the horizontal breadth of the T is not just obviously about cross disciplines. It's about the ability to be able to communicate and to, the soft skills, the ability to, handle conflict, the ability to collaborate, the ability to get along. My field of adult development naturally kind of leads into things like leadership development. I get to consult kind of in every sector you can imagine. There is no sector on the planet that has a greater tolerance for low emotional intelligence and interpersonal ineptitude than the research university. I mean, there's no other sector where people can say things like, I know he's absolutely impossible, that nobody can get along with him, that you can never put him on any committee, that he's an absolute team killer, but he's an absolute brilliant, researcher, and that's why we have to put up with him. There's almost no other sector that that will do that. I mean, just right now consulting, in business, and then they're telling me we're going to have to fire this guy, who is a fabulous client guy, and who does just terrific work on the bottom line. But we really do mean it when we say we want to really foster a certain kind of culture in this business, and he does not want to do what we want to do, and so we're going to have to help him find another place, and we're going to just have to lose him. The university has such an enormous tolerance for the I-shaped individual, okay? You don't hear much about the I-shaped individual. So, we're in order really to get better at this whole job, I think we're going to need to ask ourselves a really serious question, which is what kind of challenge do we think teaching more to the T is? And for those of you who were with me earlier today, I made this distinction between the technical and the adaptive challenge. Okay, the technical challenge is the kind of challenge that can be mastered largely through the acquisition of new skill sets. Adaptive challenges are the challenges that may involve the need to develop new skill sets, but they're never going to be adequately addressed unless they also touch on the level of mindset. Not just skill set, but mindset. And Ron Heifetz, my colleague at Harvard, he was the first to kind of bring forward this distinction, says the most common mistake that we make is trying to solve adaptive challenges through technical means. And I want to submit to you that the work of kind of developing a university that's more T-shaped, a faculty that's more T-shaped, students that are more T-shaped is not a technical challenge alone. It's just as you were saying, Phil, it has to do with shifting mindsets, shifting culture, having to examine deep assumptions about things like expertise. And what right do I have to actually stand in front of you, as your teacher if I'm not an expert on this? I mean, I've had my own little ventures, in the T-shape of the School of Education, which itself is a kind of interdisciplinary field. We wanted, the students to have, more of this breadth, and so we taught a year-long course really on kind of thinking this way, thinking like an educator, we said, which was really a kind of T-shaped approach. I mean, fairly early on, we had to look at ourselves, look at each other in the mirror. What did we think we knew about even teaching this, right? We had a brilliant, psychologist and a brilliant economist and a brilliant sociologist. We didn't have any brilliant T-shaped educators. But we had to, start with that reality does not disqualify us from being our students' teachers. And that if we confessed, to the fact that we were all going to be learning, then, maybe we have this chance to be kind of learning together. And what does smart mean anyway? Is smart about, just knowing a lot of stuff? Or is smart about knowing how to learn and knowing what are the questions that are most important to learn? And did we think, well, maybe we did have some kind of expertise to bring forward in that respect? So that brings me to my last set of remarks, teed up. I want to leave you not teed off, but feeling teed up and ready to go into your conference tomorrow, and giving you a few little thoughts about how I think we can move closer to succeeding with these kinds of T-oriented aspirations, with the proper kind of humility. And I do think, just as the provost said in her good remarks starting us off this evening, that this notion of together is not a simple idea, that really thinking deeply about what collaboration, might mean is kind of one of the leading edge kind of issues here. Recognizing that collaboration is actually difficult, and it is not a means to the end. It's actually, in some ways, the end in itself. It is actually the curriculum, as opposed to something that's getting in the way of the curriculum. There's a New Yorker cartoon that I have in my office where this one guy's sitting across from the other, and he's saying to him, I think sometimes that the collaboration process would go a lot better without you in it. And that is the way that, inevitably, if you get into real collaboration, you have to deal with being annoyed and being bored, okay? And people don't talk enough about these things. Real collaboration, is hard work. And you're going to find that people have different premises, and they have different metrics, and they have different notions about what quality is. And some big part of you is going to say, the hell with all this, I'm just going to go back to my little village, my little intellectual niche, do my work there, I know how you get respected there. And if you don't kind of feel something of this, I don't think you're actually doing the work. I think you're trying to do it technically. I think you're trying to do it in this kind of clean, smooth way that is not going to create a learning journey, for yourself, for ourselves. I mean, my experience is that to really do this, you have to come to, experience some of the triggers that are going to, disrupt you. And some of them are annoying, and some of them are about being bored. I mean, really, we had discussions. I've been on the faculty for 40 years. I had better discussions with my faculty colleagues, during the years of this experiment that I had at any other time. And some of them were very frank. Because look, there's a reason why you didn't choose to go into those other fields, right? You love your field, right? And there's a way in which these other fields didn't set you on fire, In fact, some of them may just bore you silly. And realizing that you have a certain responsibility for your boredom. Your boredom is about you. It isn't about this field that you think is somehow not very interesting. It's about you. It's about some way in which, you're not open to what there is to find in that is really exciting. At the very least, what was so interesting to the project for me was coming, first of all, to better understand the enthusiasm of my colleagues, to understand what turned them on about their field, even before we could even get to the question of whether there might be something in that, that would turn me on. The typical school setting, the university setting as a culture is a bit over-reflective and underactive, and the real world of work is overactive and under-reflective. And I think that moving more toward the teaching has to be about sort of correcting that. So I think collaboration has to go on more in terms of it being a fundamental unit for the students as well, for their own learning experience. Put them in teams, as they will be in work teams when they graduate, and give them a collective project and make them work to a deadline and create the kinds of pressures and anxieties that then create all kinds of interesting problems that people have to learn to deal with, in collaboration and in a team, so that you're able to capture some of the highly active, overactive, having to work to a deliverable kind of quality of real work life. Above all, capture all the difficulties of this kind of learning as a curriculum that deserves to be honored, not as some problem that you need to somehow take care of quickly so you can actually get to the real learning. And, to go to that third gap, unrealistic as it might sound, I would make sure that there is a learning specialist who is assigned to each one of these big projects, who knows something both about the development of the mind and the brain, who knows something both about dual processing, that we do have this analytic side. We also have, a side of us that is just continuously scanning the world for danger, that doesn't make distinctions between perceived threat and actual danger, and will interrupt our good cognitive capacities, and somebody who knows about the development of the mind, who knows that in adult development we have kind of the prospects of developing a kind of mental complexity where abstract thought can actually move toward whole systemic thought, and where whole systemic thought itself can move to the ability to think across systems. That was a 30-second review of the book In Over Our Heads that Phil was referencing. And seeing how teaching and learning actually fits into the ongoing developmental curriculum of mind. So let me just leave you with one last little story that I think in its own way, again, captures something of the theme of what I'm trying to kind of share with you here on the eve of the summit. And this is a story about a guy who goes into a bar at the end of work each day, and he orders 3 separate shot glasses of whiskey. And he proceeds to drink each of them in turn, and he does this every day until finally the bartender says, "Look, I know it's none of my business, but I don't really get it. I mean, if you know you want a triple, we have bigger glasses, why don't you just ask?" And the guy said, no, I'll explain it to you. He said, it has nothing to do with wanting a triple. He said, I have 2 brothers who I love very much, and for many years we all lived together here in the city. It was New York City. And at the end of work each day, we would get together, you know, at our favorite bar, and we'd each have a drink, and we would sit around and tease each other and talk about the day. But modern life being what it is, their work has taken them far away. One of them lives in and works in London now, one in San Antonio. We obviously can't get together at the end of work each day. But what we each do, and we each know that the other one is doing it too, is that at the end of work, we each go to our favorite bar or pub. We each order the 3 drinks. We each sit there and kind of sip them, and we're each thinking about the other and knowing that the other is thinking about us as well. That's why I have the 3 drinks. So the bartender said, great, thanks very much. I understand it completely now. Never heard anything like that before, but it's very interesting. Each day you'd see the guy coming in, he would set out the 3 drinks, he would pour the 3 drinks. One day he saw the guy coming in, he's setting out the 3 drinks, he's about to pour them. The guy said, I just want 2, just 2 drinks today. So the bartender didn't say anything. He took one of the drinks, one of the glasses back, poured the other 2. The guy came back the next day. He said, and I just want 2 today also. This time the bartender again didn't say anything, but this time he was aware that he wasn't saying anything because he was concerned if he did ask, I mean, what the guy might tell him, it might be very awkward. But the guy kept coming back and he kept ordering just the 2 drinks. It got to be too much for the curious bartender. So he said to him, listen, I know this is none of my business either, but I've just got to ask you. And he explained this whole thing to me, how you had the 3 drinks, now you only have the 2 drinks, so what has happened? So the guy looked at the bartender and he said, I've quit drinking. So, self-deception. Self-deception is a very powerful force in human affairs. Even in higher education, even in the midst of the greatest aspirations to kind of, you know, teach in a new way, to support learning in a new way, we can think we're doing one thing when really we're not. It needs to be learning for us, kind of, as well as for the students. We need just a touch of humility to recognize there are ways that we can deceive ourselves. And with that, I want to wish you a terrific conference, and thank you for letting me be just a small part of it. Thank you.